let's assume in the next session that will guide us through the next 2 hours. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the session number 2, which aims to link two completely and faraway continents and domains. And in this crossroad, we can see the foster is the world of research with the world of policy, and to open this discussion between these two worlds and to know what on the side of the producers, the researchers, and those agencies that are bringing this knowledge into the policy arena in order to get better evidence-based policy making. What are the research agendas, what they are doing, which are the efforts in order to improve research, to improve evidence, to improve primary care. And to have this discussion open, the elements at this crossroad are in fact 4 domains. First domain, I want to do it in a user-centric style. We have to start from the consumers, the users of this evidence. These, of course, are those that are at decision-making level, policy makers, and not only to regulate or to make new legislation, but also to make daily decisions that have to be also based in some sort of objectivity. Another group, and actually I want to introduce a group of panelists that they are not strictly the producers of research, but at least they are the connectors of research with policy makers. And I'm privileged to present and introduce Dr. Abdul Ghaffar from the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research at WHO headquarters. Also, you know Dr. Josep Figueras from the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies. Dr. Pandelo from the WHO European Center for Primary Healthcare in Almaty, and Dr. João Breda from the European Office Center for Prevention and Control of Non-Communicable Diseases. They are representing these connectors, but we want to listen first from the policy making, and having Lina Charcuchet-Tissiene as representative. We would like to ask her to take the floor and introduce the session from the demand side. Thank you very much.
Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure for me to share the experience of Ministry of Health in generating data and policies. To illustrate this sometimes thought process, I would like to present one practical case, multimorbidity. The prevalence of chronic conditions in Lithuania as well as in other countries is high, and we spend a lot of resources on it. It's calculated that 70 to 80% of all healthcare budgets across the European Union are spent on treating chronic diseases. Moreover, research demonstrates that the clusters of chronic conditions generate even greater challenges for health and healthcare. So, well, it's obvious that we need to do something about that we need to have policies that would respond to this challenge. But answering the question, what aspects of care should these policies target the sort of evidence? There are thousands of publications related to multimorbidity, answering thousands of research questions. And you need to have a very large analytical department that could help you to make a synthesis of this evidence-based data, and that you could use in your specific situation. Or you simply can skip this exhausting step if somebody does that for you instead. So we will let you, because we found the report of HODIS, European Commission Finance Joint Action Project. They actually performed a very great job. Firstly, they selected all evidence-based interventions related to multimorbidity Then they clustered them into the 5 components of care and highlighted that the first one, delivery of care model system, is the most essential, and while all others could be optional. Then we looked at our already planned developments of our national healthcare system. Its consolidation of hospital network, emphasis on primary healthcare, expanding the team of primary healthcare providers, increasing the independent role of nurse, and also strengthening collaboration between sectors. And then we realized that all these developments go in line with the research recommendations, except the one, the most pertinent, the delivery of care model. So we decided to develop this multimorbidity management model. We took the research-driven framework for the multimorbidity management model, and then we involved the European Union structural funds as a source of funding. And then we create a board of national experts, country representatives working in different joint actions, projects, organizations, to help Ministry of Health to take evidence-based decisions related to future models. Now we are at the point of launching the fall. Within the next 2 years, innovative multimorbidity management models will be implemented in Lithuania, tested and assessed. And the most efficient models will be expanded at the national level. They will be included into the list of the reimbursed services of national sickness funds as an incentive payment. According to an African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Policies not driven by data could be implemented quicker. However, we need long-lasting policies. Therefore, we have decided to go together with research evidence. And policymakers really need evidence-based research data. But they also need some kind of mediator, gatekeeper, or gate opener to this ocean of data. And I believe that, well, celebrating 40 years of Almaty's declaration, it's very high time to begin to speak about so-called primary research here for policymakers, which would help them to navigate better in the research ocean and to bridge policy research with practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. We have heard the view of the policymaker, the sort of evidence that they require in order to make the right policies and decisions. And you pointed out this concept of gatekeeping in the policy research connection that would be a sort of navigator that help you to drive through the massive amount of information that sometimes is available for policy making. This role of navigator connector is what we would like now to expand in our panel, and we are going to do it in a geographical way. We are going from global to local, and that's why I'd like to invite Dr. Abdul Ghaffar to address the first presentation and explain us what do you have in your research agenda for the next years.
Okay, thank you, Valentina, and thank you everybody, and good afternoon. So, as Valentina in the introductory remarks said, we are not universities, and that's not the reason that WHO has established alliance, for that matter, European Observatory. We are there as a knowledge needed to like today, but primarily we are investing on the demand side, that how can we increase the demand and how can we have the policy makers, decision makers, program can demand and use evidence to improve their policy and management decisions. So, okay, somebody else is changing, or I'm changing. Okay. So I will just give you the three sections, probably like few slides on what is the broader situation, and then a couple of slides on what we do, and then what we are doing in the primary health care. So as you know, half of the world's population lacks access to essential healthcare services. You all know it, but I just want to remind you, 100 million people pushed into extreme poverty yearly because of health expenses. Most population not covered by essential health services are disadvantaged. Primary health care is primarily that we want to enhance the equity, that it should be fair distribution of resources. So, primary healthcare systems are strengthening primary healthcare, one of the most cost-effective strategy towards universal health coverage. So there's no question about the use, utility, and effectiveness of primary healthcare. And we all understand primary healthcare systems are well positioned to address the evolving population needs, responsiveness, resilience. And the points I'm trying to reinforce is there's always a discussion that there are different market economies of the forces which always try to counter that this may not be the best approach. And the science is there, the implementation has been challenges, political support has been challenges at some point over the last 40 years. And now because of the universal health coverage and SDGs, if we don't invest into the primary health care, there's a very high likelihood that we will fail both in achieving the universal health coverage and the SDGs. Okay. And why do we want to contextualize the primary health care evidence? And I think the minister already said it. On that European level, but in many low and middle income countries, primary healthcare systems fall short of providing high quality, integrated and people-centered care. I think that's one of the challenges we are facing, especially in the low and middle income country or the resource poor setting, that there are services. We have expanded over the years the primary healthcare facilities. We have produced a lot of doctors, nurses, paramedics, but I think it is not integrated as part of the community and it's not people-centered, and in some circumstances they are having issues of high quality. And then if we want to strengthen the primary healthcare policies and the system which can deliver, design and manage the primary healthcare, we have to understand that they are increasingly demand for relevance and context. So the one thing we should understand is something which has been proven effective in Germany may not necessarily be equally effective in Ukraine or Lithuania if we really want to transfer, because the context is very different. So that we have to always factor into that. Having said that, I think we still need more health systems evidence on primary health care, including primary healthcare policy and the program implementation. And that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we had over the last 40 years. It has been successful in many countries, and then 1978 a book was commissioned, and the countries which we have a case studies were Cuba, China, JAMCAT project in India, and a couple of other countries. And we have done an exercise going back to the same countries. There have been some progress, but at the same time there have been some sort of stalemate. But in other countries where we are looking at the data, there are some challenges why it has not been as successful as we planned. So what have we done at the WHO headquarters? In 2012, we have the WHO strategy on health policy and systems research. And then we have in 2013 World Report on research for universal health coverage. Every year WHO develops a report, and this is the only report in the history of the WHO which was focusing on research. A couple of things that we forced are put into this report, both the strategy and the World Health Report, was that we want to, especially for the health policy, health system research, not necessarily for the biomedical or clinical research, the research should be embedded as part of the programs. If we don't embed research, then we will always have a challenge that there is a no to gap, there is a research which has been produced, and somebody else has to come and help the policy makers to use that evidence. And if it's embedded as a part of the program, you have a minimum chance that it will not be used because, but then embedded means like you have to involve the policy makers from the very beginning while you're writing the question, while you're setting the research priority. It's not at the dissemination level. The other is WHO. In WHO, we are promoting, advocating for more and more demand-driven research than on the supply side, which me or anybody else who is a scientist thinks this is a great idea and I can publish it to the Lancet. Nothing wrong in publishing Lancet. Richard Horton loves to have publication, but I think ultimately WHO, we are trying to help the policy and the decision makers so that they can have more effective and better decision making. Then there are some ethical imperatives for research to address issues prioritized by the health system stakeholders. And we have seen a lot of case studies. If you ask only researchers to set priorities, that priorities would be very different. But if you engage with the policy and the decision maker, the priorities are completely different. There might be some alignment, but sometimes completely different. I can give you an example which is like old, so that I don't want to be sensitive to any other countries. I was a student of public health in an American very prestigious institute. And there was a case study in Malawi. The president established a task force to reduce the infant mortality rate. So no offense to the professors of pediatrics. They assembled all the brightest professors of pediatrics in the country, and they said, what is the primary cause which we can tackle to reduce the IMR? They said, oh, neonatal mortality is like 55% of that, which is true, and then let's establish another pediatric hospital. So that was the solution, which now we all know that is one solution, but should not be the first solution. There are a lot of other interventions where you can control pneumonia, you can control diarrhea, you can have better vaccination programs, and all those things. But because those decisions are made by the people who think the hospitals are the best investment, so we have to have always some sort of like these ethical imperatives while we are doing some sort of research in the primary health care. And I said about the world's greater embedding of research in decision making. Few slides quickly, like it's not a marketing, but what we do. Alliance like the European Observatory is a hosted partnership within the WHO. We provide a unique forum for the health policy and systems research. And some of you who are maybe in Liverpool 10 days ago, we had the 5th Symposium on Health System Research, which was attended by more than 2,000 people from 149 countries. And there we work with the Health System Global, which is the professional society we established. Then we support institutional capacity for the conduct, but also for the uptake of health policy and systems research. And we have moved from investing only onto the individual capacities of the individual, which is important. We still do it, but we are investing more and more in the institutional capacity, both for the researchers, but also for the research users. Then we are stimulating the generation of knowledge and innovation to nurture learning and resilience in health system. But this is a very limited money we spend on generation of new knowledge because universities are doing much more than we should do. But there are areas where nobody else is investing, and sometimes it is not the new knowledge, it's the new synthesis of available knowledge or developing of new methods or the frameworks. And the last is we advocate for increase the demand for and use of knowledge for strengthening health systems. So now I will just move to the next. The work we have done for contribution to the primary healthcare research. We had a project which is called Primary Healthcare System. We commissioned the 20 country case studies And the aim of premises is the application of that to advance the science and performance of primary healthcare system and support the implementation, effectiveness and efficiency of primary healthcare interventions in LMICs. And the countries are Bangladesh, Cameroon, Colombia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Ghana, Indonesia, Kenya, Lebanon, Mexico. I don't have to read all, but this is like approach we use as this is one of the way we have done is towards policy relevant and actionable primary healthcare evidence so that the policymaker can use in those particular countries. It was all about participatory process, policymakers engaged in planning and conducting this study, and obviously we use the mixed methods. So this is just like two examples I'm giving. In Pakistan, the premises case studies were used for one of the documents which is for the next vision document for 2025 as one of the primary source of documents. Same in Sri Lanka for the primary healthcare policies, they use the document, and we are also doing a multi-country analysis of lower middle income country primary healthcare system, where we are going to see how these multi-country lessons could be shared with, could be some sort of commonalities or differences. And one of the contributions what we do as the Alliance for Health Policy and Systems Research, we always try to use the systems lens because we all understand that the system is complex. And again, no offense to our colleagues who are economists here, one of the disservice they have done to the health system is that they have a logic model which is input, leads to outputs, and then outcomes and the impact. It's excellent to measure the efficiency and effectiveness, but it does not work really if you want to look at the outcomes. It becomes very complex. So that is where we are promoting that the system-led system thinking. And then most money we are spending on resources, building on country's policy priority to suggest options for the policy. So we are investing in the capacities of the country leadership so that they can demand and use. And so what we are doing is in the, I think that's the last slide, the last bullet point, harnessing premises case study to enhance primary healthcare system performance, especially in the lower middle income countries. And I think that is it. That's the next slide from Joseph, and we will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll give the questions for the question and answer session, and we will now move to the next presentation from Mr. Figueras. We are narrowing the scope now from the blog. We are going to focus on the European vision. Actually, I'm actually celebrating the 20th anniversary of the observatory. So please,
thank you very much, Tina. No, I'm not going to sing, don't worry. Sorry to be back in this forum, but it's a real privilege to be able to share with you a bit the work we've been doing in this field as well. Actually, once again, Abdul, you and I complement very nicely to each other. I'm going to very much deepen, or go in more detail, more than deepen, in more detail some of the points you made, Abdul, around embedding evidence into decision making, about the importance of context, the importance of implementation, which are very much core elements of your presentation. The Observatory is a partnership which produced a number of studies and research over the years. Actually, I counted 100 studies in our 20th anniversary, plus a few hundred other articles, policy briefs, and so on. But I'm not going to concentrate so much on the what, but much more on the how, trying to sort of link with the theme also this afternoon. It's not only the research you produce, but how do you integrate that research, as Abdul said very nicely, into the decision-making process. So in many ways, I called it reflections on knowledge brokering from the Observatory Road. Understanding that we started very much as researchers. We started very much, I used to be an academic at the London School of Hygiene. I started, my co-directors are still academic, very much on the production of research. But as we got experience on the road, we realized that as important is not the production of research, but how this research, again, as Apple said, is tailored to the decision maker's needs. So actually it's very nice the word of navigator you were mentioning earlier. So it's knowledge brokering or navigator. How do you become a navigator? How you help policymakers to navigate that research and do research that really helps them. So this slide, they are not coordinated. Oh, yeah, they are coordinated. So this slide shows the partners of the observatory. Like Abdul, I'm not here to do marketing. You just go to the website and see how wonderful we are. The reason I put this slide is because of the variety of the partnership. The observatory is hosted by the WHO, but has other partners like the European Commission, the World Bank, and a number of member states. And one of the advantages of that is that we in the steering committee that meets twice a year, we have producers of research and users of research. Now we are working on our next 5-year plan, development plan, and it's been fascinating the kind of debate we have between those who do the research and those who need it. So I think it's an important lesson of some of you, some of us who are doing research, ways in which we can involve the policymakers in shaping that research. And in that sense, I like to call attention to this slide there. This is a typical slide, if you know, of the research cycle. Identifying the topic, how you shape the actual research, how you're going to tailor the dissemination, but very importantly, the impact assessment, the uptake of using decision making. The point being that you have to start on the right-hand side of the slide. Very often, again, another point that to raise, researchers, and rightly so, that's why they're there, start with an interesting policy question. Well, we need to start with a policy gap, with what are the actual needs of evidence. Also, when we think about the lack of needs, when we think about the needs for evidence for policymakers, often it's not necessarily more research. Sometimes it's about synthesizing the research that exists. Sometimes it's translating the research that exists for the individual context. So, too often as well, when policymakers say we need information on X or Y or Z, doesn't mean you need to do a new research project. Sometimes it's an issue of how you translate the existing research and you make it useful to those who make the decisions. So very much the emphasis, it may sound not that, rocket science kind of idea, but I can assure you that too often the research starts on the left-hand side, and to me the research has to start on the right-hand side and see how that needs for policymakers will then shape the kind of topic, the kind of methodology, the way you involve the stakeholders in dissemination, and so on. I'd like to share with you the 4 principles we use. They're not necessarily that terribly good, but it helps, I suppose, because they all start with a T. So translate, tailor, trust, and timing. Actually, they are very good. The only reason I say they're not very good because they're not totally self-contained. So when you talk about one, you go immediately to the other. But these 4 principles help us very much in reminding ourselves what are we here for. As I said, we started producing research, and as we evolved in our 20 years history, we realized that it was as important to translate and to embed that research in the policy making. So if we start with the translating is the point I've already exhausted and announced, which is how you reorganize the evidence in a way that appeals to policymakers and in a language that they understand. And let me emphasize the issue of a language that they understand. That's fundamental. I'll be saying a little bit more about that. So then how do we tailor our research to the specific needs of the policymakers? The first point that I already mentioned is client and policy question, not research driven. How often working with a wide network of researchers, we've got around 600 people every year, unfortunately they don't work full time for us, but they will contribute in one piece or other of the observatory every year. Researchers, policy analysts, communicators as well. Very often when we ask them, say, can you do a piece on such a question? They respond by saying, no, that's not the right question. Even if the policymakers, it's not the right question. You know, the real question is that what? No, you have to start, again, the same point with the policymakers' question. So, again, the same issue about building the research around the question. Context and specificities are already been said there, but also a big doses of humility. We need to acknowledge the limitations of research evidence. We know there is a ceiling on the impact of the evidence on decision making. And it's not cynic to accept there is a ceiling. Not to accept it is naive, I would say. And my philosophy to my staff is, let's try to reach that ceiling. If I have a rule of thumb that evidence maybe accounts for 30% of the actual decision, more than that is really Alice in Wonderland, Disneyland really. Because often the rest is determined by other factors. But if we reach that ceiling, I'm already very happy. The second issue, when we evaluated our impact on the research, always we evaluated on basis of the policymakers being aware of the evidence. So we say decision-based but not made by evidence. So what we want, I'm mixing two different concepts here, but basically what we want is our decision makers to be aware of the evidence is saying, even if ultimately they decide not to use it. We do accept that they don't use it. We want them to be aware of what are the pros and cons of the evidence which is tailored to their own particular policy question. They understand the pros and cons of various options. And importantly, we need to understand value trade-offs. In our field, particularly in the health systems organization, delivery and finance, of course there is evidence. Of course evidence is very important, but we cannot ignore the role of values and value trade-offs, and we cannot ignore that different countries have different values and different balance in values. Of course we have our own values, of course WHO has its own values, but that doesn't mean that policymakers will always agree with those and may need to use their own values to make their own decisions. I think the second important element is this trust. So trust will be very important if the research is to have some impact. So it's this idea that there needs to be a good personal contact and interaction between researchers and policymakers. There is a very interesting debate here about where should we locate evidence centers in member states, because there is this thing about too close, not good, too far, not good either. If it's too close to the ministries, then the heads of these national institutes of public health are appointed by ministers, by politicians, therefore they're not independent, they cannot provide evidence in a neutral, objective way. If they are too far, then we don't have enough trust. Then they fear that what they're doing may undermine that. So how do we get this mix, that balance between being close enough and not too close, being far enough and not too far? So this trust, this contact will be very important. Another important issue there are lots of mechanisms about that. It's very important as well, as I said earlier, that policymakers are part of the process of devising that research, deciding the priorities and so on. We're now involved in a very fascinating project for the European Union countries called To Reach, which we are working with policymakers about their own priorities for research, identifying their priorities, as well as identifying ways to translate and transfer evidence between different member states. The credibility is obviously important, the quality of the research. And the final one, I already mentioned that one, the objectivity, the neutral and non-normative. This is my nightmare scenario. One of us, one of my colleagues, one of my researchers, one of our academics, standing on top of the observatory books, being pontification, being normative, telling policymakers what to do. And unfortunately, many of us, many of you, many academics have this very bad habit to tell the policymakers what they should do. And they don't know what they should do, basically. So very much of the key to sustainability and impact is not to quantify, is not to be normative, but rather use the research, the evidence, as a platform. And I know that sounds a bit of a stereotype, I understand that, but it still is true. stereotypes sometimes are true. Evidence as a neutral platform for debate and decision making. So evidence will not make the decision. Evidence provides a platform in which you bring decision makers, different stakeholders to debate different options that fit their own context situation. The evidence will give them elements to make those decisions, but again should not be steered by evidence. It's more of a neutral platform to make decisions. I think we need to be very clear about that. When we organize policy dialogues in the observatory with our colleagues in WHO, or in the European Commission, normally we always organize those dialogues starting with the policymaker and their question. And our role as experts is to respond to that question. It's not to give presentations about our wonderful research, but respond with our experience, our research, to their own policy questions. I'm sorry, I'm overkilling this issue, but still, it's a very important one. Timely, timely, timely. As you know what the state agents say, there are 3 lessons for selling houses. You know the 3 lessons for selling houses? For the quality of housing? Location, location, location. In our field, there are 3 lessons for knowledge brokering and for research to have an impact. Timely, timely, timely. Policymakers only pay attention to the evidence when they cannot sleep, when the decision is there. In fact, one of the points we make when we do policy dialogues is to ensure that they coincide with windows of opportunity, with opportunities for decision making. Otherwise, of course, it's important to provide evidence. Of course, it's important to have an arsenal of tools. But if you want to make a difference, part of your work is going to be to identify what we call the honeymoons and the windows of opportunity. And it's easy to say and difficult to do because it means that you have to go to the quick and dirty. You have to be able sometimes to generate evidence when the opportunity is there. Sometimes you have 2-3 months to put something together to meet that particular space. So the rapid responses is an element of the observatory, the flexibility. This creates a lot of stress and hysteria among my staff because all of a sudden I ask them to stop the research they're doing and move immediately to a new piece of work that needs to be done for the presidency, for the WHO conference, for any of our partners. But again, we realize when we do that, our impact quintuplicates, literally. So it's how do you do that research in a way that coincides with windows of opportunity. It is, as Abdul said, I'm not trying to go against that, it needs to be demand-driven. If it's not demand-driven, it doesn't help. But there is a bit of Machiavellic element here of supply-induced. So it's very important that if you have particular research, try to find that fosters particular type of reforms, try to find a country that anyway wants to do that kind of reform and present you evidence there. It's straightforward, but as we know, the evidence has more impact is when it coincides when what the policymaker wants to do anyway. So you give additional ammunition. So it's not a bad way to support those reforms that actually you believe are based on the right evidence. Two final thoughts at the very end, which is trying to apply some of these principles to what we call in a kind of a rimbombant kind of title, interactive knowledge sharing mechanisms. This is basically speaking, presenting, disseminating, knowledge brokering. So please pay attention to this one, although it's quite simple. It's more than a 2-side table, it's a 3-side cube. I'll tell you in a minute the third side of the cube. In this one, the first is the vertical is policy, seniority of participants, and decision-making proximity. Too often, we're invited to present, and we do seminars and presentations and conferences, and we do the same one everywhere, with not differentiating very often the decision-making seniority or the proximity to decision-making. So these are 2 very important elements when you design those opportunities. Too often I find that we organize meetings, the usual suspects from the member states attend, these usual suspects go home, sometimes they're very influential, sometimes they're not, and that's it. So tailoring dissemination, knowledge brokering to these 2 elements will be very important. And look at the difference between a conference, a seminar, workshop, focus briefings. We tend to do lots of those closed doors directed to senior policymakers to discuss various options for reform, policy roundtables, policy dialogue options, policy dialogue implementation. So I'm not going to spend much time describing these different elements. I only want to highlight to you that please consider these two elements plus the policy cycle. When the minister has made the decisions and needs to implement that particular reform, then our support will be less focus briefing closed doors. It will be much more a broad conference where you present evidence that will support those decisions, or it will be a type of you will frame the debate with different stakeholders that are sometimes opposing to that reform. So it's how do you tailor the presentation of that research in a way that fits the needs of the policy-making cycle. It's extremely important if we are to be successful. Finally, very briefly, the policy briefs, the packaging, again, one way to call them, how do we put these policy briefs in a way that makes sense to our audiences? These are three of the briefs we did for the Tallinn conference with WHO and us together side by side. That gives you an idea of this element both of trying to synthesize evidence on key policy questions, political questions, and taking into account issues of context and implementation. For instance, the one on, I cannot read it very well, making the economic case for investing in healthcare systems. So what is the evidence what is the economic evidence? What is the evidence to make an economic case for Ministry of Finance? That policy brief, which then we used elsewhere, wasn't as much about the evidence on the impact of health on productivity and the economics. It was much more about how do you frame that evidence in a way that fits the agenda, the objectives, the goals of the Ministry of Finance, of the Minister of Finance. So it's not as much the evidence itself, but framing it, organizing it around key questions that would resound on the mind of the Minister of Finance. And to develop that evidence, we invited Hans Kluge and I, that we were leading this series, we invited a number of health people and finance people to talk around the table to try to see how we frame evidence and communicate evidence. Sorry, I'm overdoing perhaps this topic, but I think it's very, very important when you undertake the next piece of research that you have these kinds of elements in your mind. So the policy briefs, I hope you've seen them by now. If not, please have a look at them, see whether they help. They are very much a structure around this idea of practical key policy questions, always around a question, a policy question, never normative, always trying to consider the timing, as I said, targeting to policymakers, and having one-page summary, three-page summary, and 25 pages, trying to synthesize the evidence. And always, 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 if you look at them, our last set of policy briefs, for instance, those that were for the ministerial conference, the last two were for the Austrian presidency, and they were both on the issues of the Austrian presidency of the European Union, on accessing to pharmaceuticals. The prior ones were for the Maltese presidency of procurement. So we always try to tally our research to these particular events. Finally, perhaps a few questions for later, which is, I already mentioned them ad nauseam, but do not underestimate the policy question. Often, one point I have made, and I'll try to elaborate a bit further in the last couple of minutes, when a policymaker asks you a question, when we do a policy dialogue, let me start differently, when we do a policy dialogue to present evidence and we ask the demand, when the demand asks us, rather, when the policymaker says, come to present about that, often the real work is not the presentation, is actually thresh out what it is that the policymaker wants or needs. So the real work is a few weeks in advance to thresh out what is the actual question they are worried about. How often, if I had more time, give you more examples, we've been asked to say, can you come and talk about hospitals? When we talk with them, we engage in this debate, it's about contracting. Sometimes it's come to talk primary health care. No, it's actually about determinants. So it's very, very important the determination of what's the actual policy question, what is the evidence that will have a real impact on that particular country. We talked about the other elements already, the selecting the appropriate knowledge sharing mechanism, the clients, the context specificity, and the policy options and development. I haven't talked much about primary health care. I know the subject is on that. To highlight that we have plenty of studies and books and briefs and policy dialogues on the subject. Again, to align myself with Abdul to say that our approach, like his in the observatory, is to work on primary health care, but very much as part of the health system, aligning it as part of the health system, very much understanding as part of the pathway, as integrated care, as part of public health, the linkage with public health, with community care, with hospitals, and trying to understand, as the regional director was saying earlier, how the incentives align between primary health care and other parts of the health system. So that's been very much the approach of our research. We had the summer school and so on the subject, but that, if I excited you a little bit, perhaps you'll go to our web and you look at the studies. But I wanted to take this time that was given, which I abused, I think, sorry about that one, I think it took too much time, but, you know. But I wanted to emphasize the element of knowledge brokering as much more the how rather than the what of doing research in this field. Thank you very much.
Joseph, next time I will present you, I will say, Joseph, please, the bench floor is yours, because you are dancing very good. Now we are actually keeping the scope on the European region, but we are going to really focus on primary health care and health services delivered, and that's why head of the office, Mateo, of our center here, based in Normandy, will present.
And after hearing my colleagues reflecting about the comment, I think I'm in the wrong session, but I've tried to reason with you a little bit what I thought it was important to share from my perspective. I think you heard already from my colleagues many of the elements that are part of the discussion in this session. It is evidence, it is how to bridge with policies, it is clinical research also, particularly surveys, journals, publications, etc., etc. The key challenge for all of us actually here is how do we bring all these elements together. I think the difference is exactly how we do it. That's a little bit what I try to share with you. So, like the features of the work that we do are a little bit different. We are part of the regional office. The regional office in this case for the European Union is organized in division, and in our case, the center that I represent belongs to the division of health systems. Our technical work is embedded into the health systems division, which basically means there are other colleagues that are working at the same level. The creation of this center is done. We have 5 in the European region. We have one in environment, one on investment on health, one on health financing, one on surveillance of non-communicable diseases. My colleague Joao will talk about this later. And this one in Almaty on primary health care. So the approach, our approach is, of course, is embedded, it's embracing also a health system approach because we belong to the health system division. Now, from this perspective, our main mandate is to support countries to implement policies and to make differences in practice. in order to improve outcomes, we should start by that one. So the elements that have been mentioned, like contextualizing the evidence to the countries or bringing more evidence to the countries, will depend very much from country to country. We necessarily need to intervene in a country only when we receive a formal request from the ministries to support an area. And here is where the work starts, because usually, as Joseph was mentioning, maybe the question can be, oh, we need to reform primary healthcare. This is last month and probably will be the same in the next month, because now it's fashionable to talk about primary healthcare. But then we also receive, oh, we need to work in hospitals. This is the headings, and they call WHO because we need to work on the hospitals. And then we need to decode that question into a policy question, which usually cannot be one, maybe there are 10 that are embedded into that request. And that is already the first challenge. And based on that, of course, we try to understand what is the situation in the country. And there is where we discover that the data is fragmented, and I will ask my colleagues, sorry. So sorry, but it's... we need to analyze the data that is available in the country. Usually this is a partial data. The advantage of not being academic in a very strict sense is that we can use also the famous grey literature. That means that probably there are records in the country that we can bring into our discussions. Usually there is a lot of material not only from WHO but also from universities that has not been published because of the language barriers or because they are not marketed enough for a journal to be published. We have other UN agencies that are also present in the countries. And all this material are collected in order more or less to have a description of what the situation in the country is. And so the work is very much about bringing secondary data in a reorganized around a policy or more policy questions, and then usually trying to have embedded in the future activities of collaboration with the country, as was clearly also mentioned by my colleague Abdul, embedded in our work already the generation of evidence. And that, I think, so far is what you have heard. The distinctive part of our work is that then we do apply the policy advice that we give to countries. And that has been the enriching part of this exercise, because that allowed us also two elements that are important. The first one around transferability of the data that we collect or the evidence that we document in countries. And that transferability can have two aspects. One is vertical, so that we can bring, by implementing pilot projects or supporting the implementation of a project itself, we bring that evidence back to the loop of the policy cycle. Is the last slide, is this third dimension that Joseph clearly drew in his last slide, or one of his last slides. That transferability for us, that vertical transferability is extremely important. And the second one, which is also a fascinating and it is also the enriching one, is the one that we are having here, which is that horizontal transferability of what countries are doing, that we can then share what is common, that we can share with other countries, so that when we are called back, we can tell other countries, but you know, this is, the Kazakhs are doing this, the Georgians are doing that, the Lithuanians are doing this one. So that gives you a set of policy options that allow you also to sit with the minister and to somehow depict alternatives for his question or her question, and then to look for options. Which is also very interesting because we are a very small team, very committed, but in general, not only in our center, but also in our regional office, we are just a few people if you compare to the number of countries that we serve. However, that collective feeling of, we know what countries are doing has been also very helpful to provide them the possibility to link countries with countries, which sometimes we convey, but sometimes we just send, why don't you, we organize for you, we put you in contact with this other country because they are working on this area, they are very interested, because we don't have necessarily the expertise of that topic. So we broke the different stakeholders in this knowledge management basically across countries, which I think is very enriching. So with that, I think that is my contribution, and a little bit of propaganda here, if you allow me. That's what we synthesize in what our center does in these three active verbs, which is we analyze, we advise, and we share. And a little bit summarizes the work that the work that we do. I could go into details, but I think I will give also the possibility for discussion as many of the others.
Now, we keep in the European vision that we move to entities and that's because of this round.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm the last speaker, I think, and before, just before 12, which is, I think really motivating not to take too long in terms of the presentation. Of course, what I would like to first is to express our gratitude for the invitation. My colleague Pantelli invited the GDO in Moscow. We've been working together since our inception almost in a very nice way, great collaboration. And I think it's always a pleasure to work with you, and on behalf of the team, I would like to express, in fact, that recognition. We are also a geographically dispersed office. We are part, again, as this center here in Almaty, we are part of the regional office, and we are part of the division of non-communicable diseases and life course. What I will do here today is maybe a bit different from what my predecessors and my colleagues did. I'm going to be a bit more practical because I'm going to talk about what the GDO is doing in terms of providing services in the area of surveillance and research that could be used then by policymakers. So the GDO is in Moscow, which is focused on non-communicable diseases, is very much action-oriented and relying on practical aspects. So my presentation is going to be very practical. It's going to be focused on the main pillars of the core business of the office, which are, as it was said before, really the surveillance of non-communicable diseases, but also touching upon risk factors, in particular alcohol, diet, physical activity, but also supporting programs incorporated like the tobacco program and so on. And we are very lucky to be given the opportunity to look at innovation. So innovation is one of our key pillars, and of course you cannot separate innovation from research. And it's kind of, we are given the freedom to sometimes act almost as a startup and having new and crazy ideas that perhaps they may fail, which is a great thing, and we feel privileged to be given the opportunity to do that in the context of the revolution. The GDO was set up like that, and we are very happy. So asking questions, looking at the challenges is very much on our, the way we work on a daily basis. Without making any propaganda, we are not just about research, we of course are about applied research, but more than that. But as an office, we have a very high impact factor. We were looking at that, is not too bad. Not being researchers, but working for the organization. We have a very decent positioning in terms of research. This year we have produced more than 30 scientific papers, more than 12 reports, a dozen reports. And normally they are, some of those that people read, they are some of the most downloadable documents in all of the European office, and we are very proud of that. More than around 20 people, if we include also interns and fellowships and things like that, is when we invest quite significantly as well. Then different nationalities, and 60% of women, very diverse, and so on. But I will not continue, marketing the office, because we don't have any positions open at the moment, but there will be some, so feel free to apply. What I would like to really very quickly go over my slides, and you've seen, the presentation from our regional director, when you look really at SDGs as the underpinning, policy, and Health 2020. It really is important to have good evidence and to have, not just good surveillance, but also the applied research linked with it to be able to show that things are working or not, and also to really advise policymakers, as my colleague said before. In a way, our responsibilities and our mandates have been revisited and renewed very recently in New York at the global level with the last recent conference on non-communicable diseases, where a new outcome document has been adopted, and this outcome document, of course, really contains important elements in terms of surveillance and research as well. We're also looking at progress in the region. Probably many of you have seen this slide. It shows how we are doing in terms of the 9 targets of the global monitoring framework. You'll see very few greens. You'll see a lot of amber and red. This is one of the things that we are doing there in Moscow, is that we're collecting data that then provides evidence in terms of, situating countries towards their, their agreements, their responsibilities, their own, agreed objectives. We are also, of course, very much delivering on the WHO mandate at the European level and global level, where surveillance and research are strong components in terms of both the global and the European NCD action plan. And that is, of course, part of the responsibilities of the NCD office in Moscow as well. So basically, we do have tools to address the challenges that we are faced with. One of them is, of course, the servers that we are running and that we are sort of working with in the office. That they cover from the every situation to behaviors, to trends, databases, now also looking at big data, policy implementation and evaluation, but also modeling and forecasting, implementation research and applied research, and of course, last but not least, stimulating research at country level. So I will just cover very briefly these 5 topics. One of the areas where we think that we are relatively strong is, of course, in terms of powerful tools that we have. Some of the services like STEPS. STEPS is really increasing its coverage in the European region, particularly in the eastern part of the region. There were many countries with very limited information in terms of the NCDs. We are now covering at least 12 more countries, working with a few others in terms of the implementing steps. There's been countries where these surveys have been conducted for more than once already, and there's really a build-up of the minimum evidence in terms of not just the behaviors, also in terms of the health systems response to a certain extent. So steps gives you the minimum that we need to know in terms of the situation in the countries. And so far many countries didn't have it. We are very happy to report progress there. Using the HBSC, which is a study that looks at adolescents, but we are working with the data, particularly on risk factors of non-communicable diseases. So looking at physical activity, diet, looking at alcohol consumption, tobacco consumption, and so on and so forth. Also running the single biggest surveillance initiative of childhood obesity in the world. We have more than 40 countries and almost 500,000 children measured. There's nothing like that in any other region of WHO. This is a lot of information that in many cases is actually in many countries generated from primary care professionals and with primary care. For more than 50% of the countries, this type of research is done at the local level with the help of primary care doctors and nurses and nutritionists and dietitians and other professionals. So it's really very important. On the side of innovation, looking at, for example, food systems in Central Asia, where we looked at, for the first time, at the presence of trans fats and salt in common foods in some of the countries where we didn't have any information so far. We were also able to look at, salt intake. Kazakhstan, unfortunately, is the world champion of salt intake, about 20 grams of salt. In 2 studies, very good studies conducted in 2 specific regions, but this is one of the things that the GDO is actually supporting at the moment. So building up the evidence around innovative approaches. These food cities is all about looking at food composition, but in a non-traditional way. Looking at marketplaces, looking at express methods, which others are now, learning from and even bringing to the global level. So just an example of how things are improving in terms of countries, doing more cozy, doing more steps, and so on and so forth. And an illustration how you can use the data. This is data from the childhood obesity study where we see highly comparable data. I mean, in these countries, even the scales are the same. So it is possible, harmonization, all of that. This is one of the things we do. Again, based on HBSC, we were able to document increases in adolescent obesity since early 90s to 2014, and so on and so forth. Of course, we also look at policy implementation. The CCS, NCD Country Capacity Survey gives us a lot of information. It's an assessment of national capacities. It's more from the policy perspective. We do this more or less every 2 years. Next round is 2019. This is the way we report progress in terms of UN General Assembly responsibilities. A lot of interaction with the countries, collection of many documents. This is also run from our office as well. This is just an illustration of what we can do with that data and with the type of research, applied research that we can put out there. I'm not going to go into detail. Detail is just showing how countries are, how they have fully implemented the policies. This is an example from the area of alcohol, but there are, of course, many, many others. Again, then even more detail beyond the country capacity surveys on policies around diet and physical activity, alcohol, and others as well. We're also working a lot on modeling and forecasting. Policymakers like this a lot. So how do I solve the problem of obesity? How am I going to look like in 20 years in terms of, physical activity? How much do I need to cut salt in bread if I want to achieve this result? So modeling, forecasting, we have several models, several tools we work with, and it's one of the areas where our office is also doing a lot. One of the examples I could give you is the support that we provided to Portugal when they recently initiated a sugary soft drink tax. Taxation on soft drinks, very effective, but at the beginning they didn't have much, to showcase to the finance ministers. We worked together. Nowadays, the tax is a success in Portugal, in Hungary, and the office in WHO, the regional team, a lot involved on that. We're now working on same type of models, for example, example, on alcohol in Russia, and so on and so forth. We think that we also need to work more on implementation research in a more strategic and structured way, because we are not implementing the NCD best price to the full extent we can, so we can do more there. So if I'm going to have a trans fat ban, how am I going to design these policies? This may not work the same way in our country, so can we use these models to really make sure that we tackle the issues in a systematic and effective fashion. Also, finding new ways to look at complex and big problems like marketing of foods and alcohol to children and young people. This is where we need to design proper tools to really research on these fields. And this is one of the areas that we are also developing, looking at ways to document challenges that we have ahead of us in terms of many of the risk factors. So we think that we need more implementation research because we are not implementing best price properly. Intervention does not work the same way in our countries. We are working on that, trying to really provide direct support to countries that will be doing more of this in 2019. So if you are interested, you can reach out to us and we'll be ready to discuss using this logic framework, as you can see here, which I'm not going to explain, but it's again bringing a bit more structure to something that we already do. Another tool we could use is the Health Evidence Network, where we've been working with countries, looking more at the policy component. So, do we know which is the best labeling method from the policy perspective? Countries that have implemented labeling, what are the results? Countries that are trying to promote, for example, the benefits of the Nordic or the Mediterranean diet, can we document that? So using tools like, for example, the Health Evidence Network, which is policy-driven, we can really support better countries. We're now working on another report for next year in the areas of alcohol as well. So, expanding and collaborating with other divisions across the WHO, the division of information and research. And then finally, the country level, which is very important. Without forgetting the primary care, can we have more research? For example, we would be very interested on screening and brief intervention research in the context of the European region, where we feel that we need more, particularly in the eastern part of the region. So this is a bit also of a challenge, but aware that we need to do more at the country level. We also have another group of surveys I didn't talk about, but you can reach out to us if you are interested. And of course, this research does not exist if you don't see it. So it's important to publish. WHO developed is issuing this panorama, which is a scientific journal, but when it is, it's not about impact factors, it's about making your research known. It's bilingual, English and Russian, and here you have two examples, one focused on NCDs, and the other one, which actually was issued last year, also focused on nutrition. So also a way to publish your applied research. This was all possible with the support of the Russian Federation and many Russian institutions that really support our office, and you are welcome to visit us whenever you want. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, and thank you for panelists. We open now different session. In this session, as we announced before, we have the policy maker, we have the connectors, navigators, knowledge brokers. We want also to listen from the producers, of the basic producers of research. And that's why we have invited Maria Lorena Digni from in Berlin to open this question and answer, also comments about what the panelists, and we encourage the coordinators to address general questions to the panel or particular questions to the panelists if it's the case. So now is the time for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be here, and for WHO to help me arriving here, and for the warm welcoming from this university and all the people. So as I'm a medical doctor, I was already a researcher and the patient was my subject. I didn't know it at the time that I was researching, but I was posting questions and hoping the person to respond. And then I had a problem to resolve. And then, being a medical doctor, I also had to get some of the politicians' roles to communicate what I need this person to change. At this moment, I am talking about 20 years back, and for more than 12 years I'm now in Germany conducting research on health systems at the Institute of General Practice, and I have the fortune that actually opposite what is apparently needed, policy approached me to conduct some studies. So I had to worry less about how to answer the questions, because the question and the need was there, but on how to implement it. And of course, then the publication impact is not that high on the publication journals, but hopefully on the impact of getting it translated into practice. So this leads me now to, as a researcher, always to try to ask more questions. Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing research? And as I was listening to the previous panelists, thank you very much for these wonderful inputs. I kept putting notes and have now more ideas for further research that I will discuss later. But I'm saying this policy and the politicians are fast. They need answers, as it was stated. And they don't have time. And researchers by nature are very slow, and they want to take time. And then we have a gap in understanding each other. So for the projects that I do, they have to be very fast. I have 1 year or 2 years max to produce results that then lead to policy change, or that at least be informed. Because as a researcher, I cannot expect, as Joseph was saying, to tell what to do. I can just expose what to do. Then we have that also the education, and that is also one of the roles that we do in the university, is we have to train new generations of medical doctors in the medical school, but we have also other professions. And this is a very important aspect of the sustainability of this primary healthcare system. Are we taking care of the values? Are we passing the right values to the next generations? All this wonderful work that is done in all the organizations, I have to admit, is not coming much to the bottom line of the students, unfortunately, and also not to the GPs, and less to the patients. So we have like a funnel problem where we have a lot of knowledge, a lot of produced wonderful mechanisms of analysis, but when it comes to digest, it's only one drop. It's like under alimentation, it's like too little food, because mainly the students and the medical schools are focused on clinical trials, clinical research, and randomized controlled trials as the gold standard. But, as in Liverpool discussed, randomized controlled trials are not the way to produce evidence for policies. They are beautiful for doctors because to know if the intervention is good or not for the patient, but they will not give us the answers. And one of the illusions that we were discussing is that for randomized controlled trials, we are using controlled interventions in controlled systems. And for this kind of research in health policy and health systems in general practice, I have to tell you, it's an illusion. I can neither control the intervention and I cannot control the framework. I cannot control the people. So one of the thoughts is, are we maybe, and this is one of the possible questions to the panel, are we maybe ready to think about on how to measure this resilience of the interventions? How each region, each country, now we are always getting smaller in small regions and areas, because we have different cultures, values, and things that require different food. We don't like pasta with tomato. So are we ready to, for example, think or develop new models where we measure if we adapt is good, change, adaptation to new things can be good. So this moving out from rigidity could be maybe an option for evolving research methods and also for evolving and getting some answers. But most of all, we are talking now also in Astana, next week, we are talking on strengthening primary health system. I have learned that before we strengthen something, we have to heal it or make it hope, because if you have like a car and the axis is like twisted or it's like not aligned and you increase speed, you will just get hurt and break. So also one maybe of the options is, can we identify what is not working and just get rid of those? To not lose more time or money investing in things because of maybe honor, fanaticism. Are we able to say, I'm sorry, there's a mistake, that we have to change? So that is also another aspect. And in order to research the real nature of us, it leads us to the question on long-term commitment. Changing hearts and minds of people takes time to improve health. And when we see policy, research, education, teaching is also the general physician, all the medical doctors, but at the center of this magical triangle is the patient, or change it, is the population. Now we are in public health. So if we can unite at that goal, can we unite at that goal that the overall universal goal is to improve the health of the population? And if we can, are we ready to give up greed, self-importance, self-pursuit of our careers or bank accounts as individuals, as a society, as a culture? And maybe the question for health policy, can we think or find together, maybe, not only the researchers serving the politician, but really working together? And I see myself also in the next step, connecting research with those delivering the interventions. And I specialize in team work with delegation, with task shifting, with participatory approach and multi-mixed method projects with participatory components. Can we think of a way of working together towards that agreed common goal, leaving everything behind? There are a lot of questions. I have more questions now actually than before, which is good because I think confusion is a pre-state to enlightenment, somebody told me. So I hope we get some inputs. We heard about the non-communicable diseases and the killers. And we know that the killers for non-communicable diseases are, as you were saying, smoking, excesses of alcohol, obesity or non-healthy food, right? And sedentarism, lack of activity. And we also know that it is not enough to do a political campaign or information campaign, that we need somebody taking the person by the hand, which is the first line in our primary health systems. In Germany, it's the general physician with a 5 years training, family doctor. In other countries, are the nurses. So this first line of work varies from country to country. I don't forget I was a doctor, I'm not into clinical practice anymore, I'm moving to research. And maybe this is another point for politicians. Maybe it is also good not to forget that we will be also a patient. So what kind of quality of primary health care we need for us in the future? When we maybe all of our friends are dead and we are not only a phone call away from getting the best service, when we are maybe not in power and are older. In Europe we have an aging population. Are we taking care of that? Or are we still maybe in the imaginary of the population? It's always about pregnant women, children and vaccination. A new project that I have, for example, is looking forward on how to prepare our health systems in Germany to deal with the fact that we have many more women, about 50 years, that are living longer. And we have a shortage of GPs, a shortage of gynecologists that are actually not really working together. So first is to dismantle these barriers, interprofessional collaboration, and the question for policy. Can we place the incentives on the right spot so that we not only strengthen the system, but that we make a forward direction into the right direction? So those are some of the questions that I brought, and I want maybe now to get back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One more NCDs.
I'd like to react on two of them. One is, of course, on NCDs and, I mean, primary care, frontline. How can we not just deliver more and better care, but also the prevention services on all of that? I mean, we are strong believers that there is a strong role to play, and we can be more innovative there. The other one is on the, I agree with you, the RCTs, which are really not an answer. But this is why we've been developing new approaches. Stuff like, national experiments and implementation research. There are responses. If we leave the paradigm of, we would all love to have RCTs. Okay, fine. But if we can't, then we also need to make the other research more valuable. And we are missing that, especially journals. I mean, I'm not seeing the Lancet publishing, stuff which is implementation research. Something we should maybe discuss with somebody else. I mean, why are we stuck with this? On the other hand, if you have 300,000 people, you can have a follow-up study full of bias, it's okay, no problem. And you get this garbage published in the best journal. While good implementation research, you don't publish it anywhere, or you publish it in Panorama. Zero impact facts. Still worth doing.
You shouldn't say that.
Спасибо большое. Я бы хотела очень добавить политикам о том, что забывается очень огромная роль медицинских сестер. Сегодня происходит постарение населения. Продолжительность жизни у нас увеличивается. Каждый пациент имеет по 3-4 хронические заболевания. Вот здесь роль медицинской сестры как раз очень-очень велика. И не нужно здесь, может быть, изобретать велосипед. Сейчас очень много проводится исследований. В той же Германии Клаудия Маркли проводила исследования в 29 странах. Было доказано о том, что там, где в первичном здравоохранении, в стационаре велика роль медицинских сестер, показатели гораздо улучшаются. Поэтому вот я думаю, что акушеркам сейчас женщины в более позднее время рожают по несколько детей. Поэтому в некоторых странах вообще нет акушерства. Вот, наверное, здесь не надо так много врачей, тем более в сельской местности их не хватает. Медицинские сестры проводят акции, проводят профилактическую работу. И вот политикам, наверное, нужно обратить внимание все-таки, что это огромная армия, которая может достаточно сделать вот переворот в оказании первичной медицинской помощи.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I would like to just respond to Maria and then maybe a little bit of that. I think we have raised a lot of questions which are all very important and interesting. RCTs are very important for the basic science biomedical research, no question, and we say this is the gold standard. The problem comes when we want to say the RCTs are the gold standard in the schools of public health and schools of medicine, and then we want to say this is the gold standard for research, and that's not the gold standard for health policy systems or the implementation research. But the problem is a little deeper. Most of us still go in the health are medics. Doctors, nurses, we are trained not for logic, but to remember everything. So when you go to the school of medicine, logic is gone. Then we go to the schools of public health, then we are conditioned into FP and bio. But we forget that the systems research, policy research, implementation research is not only a discipline for the medicine, but it's also for the agriculture. It is also for other departments, like the sectors of the population. And when I joined like 10 years ago as a director, I always had to stand up and defend, oh, it's a fluffy science. It's it's not published in Lancet, it's not published there, which is true. But then in 2012, when we wrote the report for health policy assessment, there's a chapter in which is called Coming of Age. We said, why should we keep on defending ourselves that this is not our good standard? So I think that's the mindset that we have to change. That if we want to do the implementation research, system policy research, then there are other proven effective methods that we have to do it. And one of the things which I want to share with you, that Joseph also mentioned, we have developed the science of synthesis of the systematic reviews. Historically, this was also about the effectiveness, clinical trials. But now there's a science, we funded like 10 systematic review centers, and now we have advanced the science of rapid reviews, which could be done from, depending on the question for a minister or the Secretary of Health, from 6 weeks to 3 months, which was historically more than a year, 9 months. So that's a science, this is happening, people are doing it. And that is, we are now sporting 5 embedded rapid review centers after doing the experiments in the Ministry of Health of India, the Ministry of Health of Malaysia, the Ministry of Health of Zimbabwe, and in the Parliament of Georgia. So that is the effort we have all collectively made, that there should be a science which should be helpful to the people who want to use it. The other thing I think is like the nurses issue and the doctors issue. And I think when I was in a medical school, which was a long time ago, we had this discussion why doctors don't go to the rural. They will never do it. The reason is the people who are from the US, they know before 1981 or 83, the American Medical Association was one of the biggest lobbies for the presidential campaign. Doctors are very powerful. They are mostly from the elite. They want to stay, they want to control it. But I think the sad part is the people who are in the Ministry of Health or the WHO making the decision. We have created the demand that everybody needs a doctor, even in the remote population sites. There's no discrimination. There is a lot, 95% of the things could be done by a trained nurse or midwife or medic, other paramedic. So I think that's an incentive structure, that's a marketing structure, and that goes beyond only ministries of health. So I think that's the fight we have to, and we should fight. We should raise the voice we are raising, but it is a long battle. And I think it's the same battle I'll just finish. But you know, there's a debate. People say, why people are migrating to the cities? In the history of this world, nobody has migrated back from the cities to the rural population, except very few exceptions. So it's just a human development issue. So people who want to be doctors, they want to marry beautiful girls and boys, and they want to stay in the city.
Thank you. One quick reaction from Giuseppe, and then we move.
Yes, very briefly to Valentina Sartasova. I couldn't underline more the points you made. Just some good news. Claudia Meyer, that you mentioned, we are launching in 2 days in Astana a couple of volumes on skill mix, where we'll be looking at the cost effectiveness of different approaches to primary healthcare and community care. And certainly the most cost effective ones, as you'll see, the most innovative ones involve the leadership of the nursing profession, as well as many other professionals, allied professionals. So the evidence is on our side. Now is the politics that is complex because of the culture of the medical profession and of the decision makers that are not that open sometimes because it still makes. To Maria Lorena, I enjoyed the way you signaled, you signposted the key challenges on the researchers and the research to make evidence that is relevant for policymakers. I mean, the good news again is there is some mechanisms to overcome that. I mean, the challenge, as you very nicely put it, is the research we need is softy. So, you know, has low impact factor, has been said. Research impact factor doesn't pay the bills because researchers need to have a high research impact factor to be promoted. So they always tell me when they work for me that they enjoy it, but it's useless because they really don't get to have that kind of CV that attracts resources to their universities. Again, because we cannot use RCTs, again, the kind of research we do is very softy, more superficial, some researchers would say. Working on context, as you were saying, I mean, what we are arguing is that rather than measuring the impact of the interventions themselves, I mean, a lot of the research is about trying to adjust for context and measure the impact of the intervention. What we're saying is what we need to do is measure context and the role that context has on the impact of the intervention. So again, that's the kind of research that researchers don't like to do. So the positive side of it is that some universities now are valuing very much the policy impact factor, something the Dutch and the British start doing. It's very difficult to measure though. It's very difficult to measure the extent to which a particular piece of research has impact on policy. Also, there are ways in which you can provide incentives. For instance, within the observatory, we managed to get a lot of our studies being under Medline. That has attracted more researchers to work with us. Also, what we did is have links with journals like Health Policy, by which we get open access of articles. So when they work for us monitoring health systems, then we tie with, we link with a journal, and some of that gets published in the form of articles, and then we get open access to our policymakers, and they get in their CV. Also on the area of embedding research into policy making, there is a number of schemes like getting policymakers embedded in universities for short sabbaticals and vice versa, to understand and translate. So there's a lot of things you can do. The problem is incentives. To me, it's incentives. Is that researchers and policymakers don't have incentives in place to actually come together because the mechanisms are there actually.
Thank you, Joseph. Let's, if we can go for the comments because you will comment later. Back into this Robert Johnson, Felix, sorry,
thank you very much. So, I started my career almost 20 years ago in Washington, D.C. as part of a, is there a problem? No, okay. As part of an effort to bring research closer to policymakers, to cultivate relationships, and to plant seeds so that when windows open, we would be able to take advantage of it. And it's been a very, very nice model. Such an important model that the new center that I opened this summer is designed to build on that capacity. The conversation that we're having here is exemplary of that. So this idea that Maria brought up about the variation in how primary care is implemented in different countries is a critical one. There's a level of sufficiency, and there's a level of excellence, and there are everything in between. So when we convened the World Health Organization, World Bank, OECD, Gates Foundation last December, around the conversation of how do you measure spending on primary care, the question really evolved into this one. In some countries, you can only measure it by who delivers it. In other countries, you can only measure it by who and where they deliver it. And in other countries, you can expand further and say who, where, in the context of continuity, comprehensiveness, coordination, and first contact. So you're really looking at the full effects of primary care. And that matters because Barbara Starfield and others, and we've reproduced this work recently, when you can get to that high level of complexity, you can reduce hospitalizations by 30%. When you can build out continuity and build on relationships, not in the policy arena, although it translates well, but in the clinical arena, you can reduce hospitalizations by 15%. That kind of investment in primary care, to let it become robust, reduces total healthcare spending by a lot. So we have to be really careful, and we have to apply the research, and that's why I hope the next time we have this conversation, Dr. Jacob is up here speaking about what the center, the very critical center here in Almaty is doing in the way of research, is what are we talking about, how are we measuring it, and how are we delivering it. So in 2009, I got a phone call from a young radiologist who had read one of our papers. And her question to me is, I just read this paper in Medical Economics about putting more payment into primary care. And we're thinking about putting 50% more into primary care. And I said, I'm sorry, who is this? Well, I'm at the White House, and we're writing the Obamacare, and we're looking at a primary care incentive payment that we'd like to put in, and we happen to read your paper. You have 48 hours to help us figure out how to put this in. So, Joseph, I'm very jealous of the 3-month window. We had 48 hours to help them put this policy in place. Now, I've written over 300 papers, and this, I can count on one hand the number of times I've had a call about a research study by a policymaker wanting to try and figure out how to apply it. So a lot of the discussion that's been had here, and Joseph, I think you touched on a lot of it, is critical. We have to find ways to contextualize and make our research relevant. But the question I want to put to the team, because I think you have developed quite a resource, is investment in institutional capacity. Abdul, what does that mean? In our setting, it means increasing the ability of primary care researchers and health services researchers to speak to policy needs when they come up. What does that look like on the local level? Because when all politics are local, that's important. That's an important distinction. Joseph, to your point about knowledge brokering, I love the way you package that. But how do we create more brokers? We are creating a lot of researchers, but how do we create people who have the training and the capacity to translate for policymakers? It is such a skill, but when you're gone, I'm gone, who comes after us, and how do we train them? And that's why I was keen on Joel's comment about having fellows and scholars come in. My first fellow in a health policy research fellowship went on to become one of the leaders of the federal agency. So that when I started talking to him about the Agricultural Extension Service in the United States that revolutionized farming, we started having a conversation about how they spend $2 million trying to figure that out. And then he brought me into a conversation with our Innovation Center, and it turned into $1 billion in demonstration efforts that was implemented over the last 4 years on how you translate and how you transform primary care. How do we actually put people into those settings to help them transform them? What do you have to pay them to make it happen? And then how do we sustain that? And that's my last question. The policy cycles are short. These interventions are long, at least in terms of realizing their impact. So how do we as researchers in a policy arena help them speed up the evaluation cycle so that they're getting information before these programs die? How do we help them figure out what to sustain, what it costs to sustain it, and what the outcomes will be? I'll stop there.
Before answering the questions, we would like to have also the comments from Howard and Rosa, and then we can combine probably some questions. So next is Howard Kaplan, who is the National Strategic Process.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you for the fantastic presentations as well. Thank you, Valentina, for your contribution to case of nursing, which of course I completely support. There's very little to add to it than to remind us that nurses and midwives, the 23-24 million constitute about half the healthcare workforce, is estimated are responsible for around 75–80% of primary healthcare interventions. Huge wide varied range of roles from first contact through to chronic and long-term conditions. But the one thing that we probably didn't talk about as well as worth mentioning is that in a number of countries where surveys are undertaken in terms of who the most trusted people are, including public professions and including politicians, nurses consistently come out at the top. And I wonder whether there is something in terms of the relationship that nurses have with people in the populations around some of the change behaviours, but also systems behaviours that we could be doing even more with. But the first question that I had in listening to the presentations, and I've slipped in that night at making my union professional points and arguments, and all of us have said how important multidisciplinary team approaches are to future models of care. We all accept that. Do we really understand enough about how high-performing effective health teams work in terms of how they're led, how they interact, how referrals are made, how they communicate, where they're located, if they need to be co-located, how they're put together, what support systems and technology are around them, as well. So I wonder whether there is, in terms of the research, is there a gap, is there a place that we need to look to try and fill more our understanding about how multidisciplinary teams work and how they're effective. Just in terms of evidence, I just want to share just some examples from nursing background. We have very good evidence, Valentina mentioned some of the areas where we know that nursing for a higher level of education, mortality rates go down. Where there are more registered nurses on the ward, mortality rates decrease, toward incidence of pressure ulcers, infection rates, those sorts of things also decrease as well. So the education and the numbers of registered nurses are important, but whenever I make that argument, people already think, well, he would say that because he's the nurse on behalf of the nursing profession. It can sound terribly self-interested, but actually those arguments that I've just made are really about patient safety and about patient quality. So I was talking to Brett at the break in terms of whether there is something about how we're framing some of these arguments around workforce which need to more clearly articulate quality and safety. And it picks up on a little bit of a point that Paul made as well, because I have been in countless rooms where I have made evidence case to politicians and to policymakers who said how we get it, but we can't afford one more registered nurse per ward for this hospital. And because the profession is big, by the time we total all of that up, what it costs like across the system, and you come back and you say that yes, if you make that investment now, then these are the sorts of gains in terms of reduced admissions, longer life expectancy, better quality of health that you will get 5, 10, 15 years out. So yeah, we get that now, but my political return in 1 or 2 years' time, I need it now, I need it much more quickly. And there's the same cost politics issue, which Joseph has highlighted some of the really helpful pragmatic steps to think about windows of opportunity. I think we need to grapple with this a little bit more. I've had discussions in countries about different models of primary healthcare, which again, the political leaders have agreed with. But when it comes to changing the hospital in their constituency, which is beloved of the people who they vote for them, they'll stand outside the hospital gates and protect any changes to the hospital. So getting in more to the cost and politics argument was really important. The third area that struck me as well in terms of listening to the evidence and the case studies, I think many of our organisations do this, we do this from ICH, to try and bring forward case studies which show that golden thread from practice to policy, and what policy will help practice and how practice can inform policy. But often when I go into health systems and organisations, there feels like a huge gulf between people at the front line and those in leadership, decision-making and policy-making positions. And I wonder whether there is something about the engagement mechanisms within health systems and health organisations, what we might call clinical governance, or the opportunities for staff genuinely to feel that their voice is heard and can be raised through a system that's taken account alongside the evidence, the voices from the front line. A test often for that for us within nursing are whether you have a chief nursing officer at the top table within a healthcare organisation, or indeed within the country, that you have a chief nurse in the country. Our medical colleagues have done better on that, but I think there's something in this piece, question mark, about whether clinical leadership and clinical engagement needs to be wrapped up much more within our health systems and organisations. And then the final point and question again was, I guess, what I sometimes see, the disconnect between how we think about and plan our health workforce and how we plan our health systems. So those people concerned concerned with planning the workforce, I worry about numbers, whether you put people in the right place, how we're educating people. That's all very well and good, but if we start from the health need, population demand, and perhaps from JOAs and NCDs to say, actually, nurse-led services might be the normal model for delivering and supporting NCDs in the future. We start from that and then say, so what does that mean for how we plan the workforce? Do we need that switch? Have we got health workforce planning systems and health model systems properly aligned? Thanks very much.
Just a final comment, also as well from the national in Kazakhstan. Please, Rosha.
Конечно, все профессии в здравоохранении очень важны, но все-таки особая роль принадлежит действительно первичной медико-санитарной помощи, и масса реформ, которые проводятся по МСП, она в первую очередь касается тех, кто должен исполнять эти реформы. То есть это специалисты, врачи, медицинские сестры, в Казахстане это и социальные работники, психологи, которые командой работают по МСП. Мне бы хотелось сказать, что я вижу в Казахстане, думаю, что во многих странах, особенно постсоветского пространства, это то, что существует дисбаланс. Дисбаланс между наукой, образованием, политикой и практикой. Очень много делается, этого никто не отрицает. То есть внедряются инновации, создаются протоколы, проводятся разные реформы в ПМСП, допустим, и создаются различные концепции, и они чаще носят такой фрагментарный характер. И вот проводят также пилоты, тоже по политическим соображениям, по профессиональным различные проводят пилоты, и так получается, что, допустим, инновации, которые проходят в практике ПМСП, не знают те, кто работает в образовательных организациях, например, в университетах и колледжах, которые готовят сестер, они эти инновации по своим программам могут не давать, и очень часто первичное здравоохранение как бы опережает образовательные организации. Или, например, я бы хотела сказать, что бывает так, что нет последовательной политики. Могут меняться руководители, приоритеты, соответственно, могут меняться. И поэтому, опять таким образом, начинает страдать первичное здравоохранение. И иногда бывают такие приказы выходят, которые, может быть, не согласованы с практикой здравоохранения. То есть я хочу сказать, что, да, и в части науки тоже, я бы не сказала, что хорошо развиты научные исследования в области первичного здравоохранения. И поэтому, конечно, проблем самых разных много. Но, тем не менее, конечно, движение идет, потому что и сестрица внедряется самостоятельно, и семейная медицина продвигается, и новые медико-социальные технологии у нас, и доказательная медицина, и цифровизация на уровне ПМСП, эти процессы идут. Но мне бы хотелось сказать, с позиции, вот сейчас я представляю, много лет проработала в практике, занималась также наукой, и я бы хотела сказать, что мы сейчас сделали, создав национальную ассоциацию Primary Health Care. Это то, что мы все-таки нашли такое решение, и я, может быть, хочу поделиться для вас. Это то, что, например, мы настолько стали, ну, как бы сказать, гармонично работать, потому что в эту ассоциацию вошли эксперты, лучшие эксперты в области ПМСП нашей страны. И мы заключили меморандумы с Министерством здравоохранения, с управлениями здравоохранения всей страны практически. И уже провели по заданию Министерства здравоохранения для 16 центров лучших практик трехдневное обучение в части развития, прогрессивного развития ПМСП. Дело в том, что сейчас технологии обучения должны меняться специализация. Мне кажется, мы это должны обратить в вузы, тоже так обучать, чтобы это легко как-то и давалось, легко воспринималось, чтобы люди не уставали, чтобы это было им интересно, и чтобы это хорошо очень ложилось, и чтобы вот действительно развивались вот эти мыслительные способности специалистов. Второе, значит, вот выходят специалисты из вузов, из колледжей. К сожалению, мы видим, и это мы уже обсуждали с вузами, нет такого интереса у них работать в первичном здравоохранении, потому что очень тяжело. Много требований населения, много проверок, много приказов, огромная загруженность. То есть вот есть такие моменты, которые мы изнутри все это хорошо знаем. И, к сожалению, хотя у нас и внедряются финансовые механизмы мотивации специалистов по МСП, но это недостаточно, потому что не разработаны инструменты по мотивации по профилактике, по мотивации, например, населения, как сделать так, чтобы они стремились следить за своим здоровьем, чтобы мы оценивали именно больше не по обращению по болезням, а именно как вот, какие новые, может быть, инновации можно сделать в части создания здоровой модели поведения населения. То есть вот хороший опыт передавать, какие-то интересные находки есть. И вот я что хочу сказать, вот решение мы нашли такое, что с Министерством здравоохранения и с департаментом мы начали обучение от имени ассоциации, значит, по МСП страны. Второе, мы обучали не только сами, мы объединились с Союзом колледжа сестер, мы объединились с Финским университетом. И у нас предстоят уже еще по всей стране вот такие провести обучения. И я, уважаемый Пантелло, тоже приглашаю вас принять участие, когда у нас будет по регионам, я могу вам сообщить, чтобы можно было и, значит, рекомендации, интересный опыт, и ВОЗа тоже предоставить. Теперь мы вышли с инициативой к вузам, у нас 6 вузов в стране, вышли с инициативой, чтобы лучшие практики в МСП обучили преподавателей колледжей и университетов, потому что у нас внедряются новые программы в практике, а их часто не знают наши ученые и преподаватели. И я так благодарна Министерству здравоохранения, что они откликнулись, и у нас тоже уже скоро начнется обучение, буквально с ноября, значит, преподавателей общественного здравоохранения, кафедр семейной медицины и медицинских сестер, вот, инновация в практическом здравоохранении по МСП. Затем я хотела сказать, что ассоциация начала активное выступление в СМИ и значит, телевидение в части, я бы сказала, вот мы говорим сегодня о передаче знаний, да, о распространении знаний, то мы тоже, мы говорим проблемы, в то же время мы предлагаем решения тоже и привлекаем к этому население, чтобы они тоже в этом процессе участвовали. Вот. И также я бы хотела, чтобы мы все-таки старались, смогли передавать хороший опыт достижений, которые есть в МСП, различных проектов, пилотов. И также мы даже попросили, например, что мы готовы даже провести аналитический обзор эффективности МСП в Республике Казахстан. То есть там надо показать экономическую эффективность и медицинскую, и социальную, потому что, к сожалению, в части по МСП мало идет анализов, и это не секрет, у нас очень высокая потребляемость услуг населением профильных специалистов, нежели специалистов по МСП. То есть я хочу сказать, что Национальная ассоциация сейчас старается построить гармоничные отношения с министерством, с управлением здравоохранения. Вот здесь присутствуют специалисты, главные нескольких областей. Я так была счастлива, что смогла пообщаться. Мы сразу переговорили о том, что мы приедем и приведем для всех регионов, тех, о которых мы говорили, Кызылординская область, Карагандинская область, здесь сидят, они нам организуют, значит, ну, так сказать, ключевых людей, чтобы мы могли обсудить с ними и политику, как мы дальше должны двигаться, что мы можем внедрить. Потому что по МСП в Казахстане, хотя у нас чтобы и те люди, которые поставляют услуги, специалисты, и врачи, и сестры, социальные работники, и психологи, специалисты, тоже были счастливы и удовлетворены, давая услуги, потому что только тогда они смогут оказать полноценную, качественную помощь населению, ну, на котором они обслуживают. И также мы построили хорошие отношения с профессиональными ассоциациями, и мы уже обсуждаем то, чтобы совместно с ними проводить вот такие конференции или семинары, или какие-то круглые столы, в которых мы могли бы обсуждать ключевые важные аспекты для быстрого разрешения проблем в ПМСП Казахстана. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you, Rosa. Big questions that have been addressed specifically to you. One question said regarding how to create more knowledge brokers, one on institutional capacity for Abdul, and maybe one evidence on multidisciplinary teams. And with this we can close the session. So please, Abdul.
Okay, thanks, Robert. I think you may have not realized the mandate here that the department had has only a vision and mandate to advance and support the learning and development. So there, what we have been doing over the years is like giving the grants to the individuals, and that has contributed to the capacity because we want to strengthen the national or the local knowledge capacity, so that there is a more locally relevant knowledge but not into the peer-reviewed publication. There we are trying different interventions, including some sort of support to the faculty, salaries, stipend, infrastructure, and other sustainable grants, because you may have a PhD from Hopkins, but if you don't have the money to do the research, your incentive is not there. There are different interdisciplinary mechanisms we are investing in. That's what I meant.
Thank you, Robert. I did enjoy very much the way you outlined the various complexities and issues there. And I like in particular, I will ask this question to you as well, how do we get knowledge brokers? We have a real debate there as to should be the researchers, should be the policy makers turn knowledge brokers, or researchers turn knowledge brokers, or should be a new profession. A lot has to do with incentives that we provide to them, a lot has to do with the training, a lot has to do with the prestige of doing so. And there are many schools of thought, a bit more time we can discuss that later on. But perhaps the two things that are as important is not the knowledge brokers themselves, but the design of what they are called national research organizations or regional and research projects. We did a review with a project called Bridge a few years ago, and we went through up to 100 national institutions that they put themselves as doing knowledge brokering and doing research for policy. It was very humbling to see that there were no products for policymakers. Policymakers were not involved in the research priorities. All were long volumes that, you lose the will to read after you start reading them. None of them had products for policymakers. So it's about the design of organizations, having in mind the policy audience. And the same for research projects. I'm involved in many of those as advisor, the ones, many organizations same problem, but the ones in this case of Digital Research European Union. And they put millions into that, and then at the end they say something like dissemination. Dissemination means one conference at the end to be attended by policymakers, which is usually the usual suspects, and a website that disconnects 30 seconds after the money is gone. So if these research projects, and it's not just the European Commission, it's all national research agencies, we're working now with them, to try to call for research projects that are more attuned to the needs of decision makers, because if these research organizations put more emphasis on the funding for the actual dissemination and impact, and for innovating tools to do that, it would make a huge difference. So it's not just the knowledge brokers, it's the whole way in which we design the research. I know we're running out of time, but just one statistic we showed a while ago to Digital Research was that there was around €1 million per paper published out of this project, which is kind of scary. And
some of these papers, that was some years ago, things have changed. And some of these papers were in great journals, so the impact factor was very low in policy terms and research terms.
Thank you. And perhaps on the multidisciplinary teams tomorrow, my colleague Jill Farrington will have a lot focusing also on that. And we have Jan Massimo will have published recently an article dedicated. But I thought it was important also because, you know, connecting some of the dots that Lorena, but also Robert raised up regarding more research on these policies. Political cycles that are very short, and so the windows of opportunities are very short. We know what we have to do. We have enough evidence for the key growth accelerators, or whatever we call it, must-dos, that any ministry should be doing or should be working on if we want to strengthen primary health care. So the challenge is not too much to understand what are the priorities when we arrive there. Is just how we contextualize those, how we transfer those from other countries to the local context, and I think that goes back. But importantly also, and it has not been made explicit, is that managing the change towards the implementation of those policy accelerators, because that's the real challenge there. And that is a learning and a research in itself, that we have to learn to distinguish between the policy questions, the policy research that we want to, the research policy that we want to question that we want to address, and the implementation.
Thank you, Juan. Here we are closing session 2, day 1. We wait for you tomorrow. We have this interesting sessions on education and practice. And before leaving, I just want to thank all the panelists, all commentators, our policymakers, and all of you